Hello, and welcome to the MIT SDM Systems Thinking webinar series. My name is Naomi Gutierrez, Communications Administrator for SDM, and I am today's host. Thank you for joining us. Our speaker today is Donna Rhodes, Principal Research Scientist in the Socio-Technical Systems Research Center at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is the Director of the Systems Engineering Advancement Research Initiative. Dr. Rhodes conducts research on innovative approaches for architecting socio-technical systems and enterprises, digital transformation, digital twins, human model interaction, and model-centric decision-making. She previously held senior leadership positions at IBM, Lockheed Martin, and Lucent Technologies. She received her PhD in systems science from the T.J. Watson School of Engineering at Binghamton University. Her talk today is titled Investigating the Future of Curated Model Collections. If you have questions for Donna, please enter them into the chat window at the side of the video. They will be addressed during the Q&A portion of this session. The recording of this presentation will be available online after today's session, and a link will be sent to all registrants. And Donna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Today's talk, I'd like to share a bit of an envisioned future for curated model collections. And over the past, I would say, 6 or 7 years, we've been doing various research efforts that will hopefully support this. And so what I'd like to do is to tell you a bit about the motivation for this, some of the things that will be required for us to actually realize this kind of vision, and the various research directions that we hope to continue on in the future. So the motivation really is around all of the disruptive change we're experiencing in engineering enterprises around model-centric practice. And it's a good time, although we're dealing with a lot of current challenges, to start thinking about the far future and where we want to take things. And so this research is somewhat future oriented, but there are decisions that really need to be made today if we're going to be able to achieve such a thing. Now, we're also looking at the development of a lot of technologies that also enable us to have better models, as well as do a much better job of reusing models than we have in the past. And further, to be able to compose models in ways that we weren't able to. So in this future, we're going toward the kind of future where we'll see digital twins coexisting, so that while a system is out there in operations, there will be this digital equivalent that is comprised of various models. So I would argue that models are really becoming so valuable to enterprises that ultimately these models may even have greater value than the physical assets themselves, if they can indeed be repurposed. So to get you thinking about the idea of curation and a curator role, think about a big institution like an art museum. Now imagine if painters could just paint pictures, they could carry them into the museum and put them on the wall. They could take someone else's painting off the wall and replace it with their own. They could decide they wanted to borrow a painting and just take it away and use it. So in a large institution like this, there is a role that sits above the care and maintenance and the administration of an art collection. And this role is that of a curator. So the curator has a governance role. And that governance role is a very important one because they are controlling things in terms of making decisions about what things come in and out of that collection. They are the ones who basically are responsible for deciding strategically what, for example, new pieces should come in. So let me tell you a little bit more about curation, what we call model curator and model curating. Now, one of the things that we're thinking about in this vision for the future is that while we may have collections of models that are now, say, within a company at a business unit level or program level, we really don't see a lot of, in at least in larger companies, the idea where models are really managed and governed as an enterprise level collection. And further, in a large enterprise, for example, you'll see a lot of variation in different pockets of the business about the competency people have or the resources they have in order to do model-based engineering. And they're not always strategically managed at that enterprise level. And I think there could be more value if we do that. And repositories are not new to us, but really digital transformation is impacting. Why are they important, and to what scale can we do this? So if you go back to the idea of the museum curator, a few other things about that. So I mentioned that you can have a curator, and when I speak of a curator, it's not necessarily an individual. It's probably a committee of people, a governance board. Uh, that curator will decide again what pieces are allowed to come into the collection, and that's called a session. They will also make the very important decision about what pieces to take out of that collection, deaccession. And if you think of those of you who've been in the field for some time, you'll have known like maybe various efforts like on lessons learned databases. And one of the big problems has been not putting things into it, but trying to keep things current. So only the most valuable things right now are there. If a collection becomes overwhelmed with pieces, then it just gets unmanageable. So deaccession, very important. The curator also is responsible for the valuation of the assets in that collection. They would arrange for a strategic loan or acquisition of a painting. They would set policy and practices for how that's done. The strategic planning, say, of future exhibits. And I think that leadership role in exhibits is one that we need to think a lot about. And I'll return to that thought toward the end of the talk. Now, if we want to think about model curation, and by model, in this case, I mean an abstraction of reality. So models could be, SysML model, it could be a finite element model, it could be a conceptual model, reference architecture. I'm speaking very broadly about models here. There are many other fields of curation, and we have been learning from those fields. Many of them have very established practices that we can adapt for our purposes. Some of them are digital curation, social curation, data curation is one that's especially similar to what kind of role we will need in model curation. And then also biomedical model curation, which is quite far ahead as far as using models from a community standpoint. There's significant work that's been done in the field of digital model curation. And there is, for example, a life cycle curation model that's come out of the Digital Curation Center in the UK. So these things are well-defined practices. They've been studied. And so we've been looking in our research at these 4 exemplars. You'll see a working definition of model curation in the blue box on the screen. A couple of important parts about that are that we're talking about management, control, and preservation as you would in an art museum, but we're also talking about active enhancement of those models that are in the collection. And the purpose of that active enhancement is to make sure that they're valuable not only for current use, but for future use as well. In this future that we envision as having much more repurposing of models beyond their original purpose and their original context of use. Lots of activities, I think surely 2 of the most important ones for us in engineering are the model accessioning, which I mentioned, that control. All models are useful, and some exist, in the individual laptop. Some exist in a shared collection for a project. But not all of those models will come up into an enterprise level collection because some level of investment is going to be required to maintain those in the enterprise level collection. So it has to be a really well thought through decision about what comes in and what goes out. And further, I've seen a lot of people in industry for some years now struggling with, let's say, programs where you're teamed up with someone who is your competitor in one case, and now they're your partner. This really difficult situation where you want to share models and loan models to others involves a lot of IP considerations, a lot of agreements, and it's been a bit of a barrier for people to really be successful on projects that involve teaming of strategic partners. And so curation can help to put some governance and oversight and some practices in place that will support that process. Let's talk a little about the curated model collection and what we think that these will look like in the future. I mentioned that I think not all models are going to belong in a collection, but there are two types in my mind that will be there. And those have a longer duration than what we might normally use a model for. So one is the digital twins. So models, when you begin the development of a project, there are models that you use in design, in the development, and then some of those models will be carried up, and digital twin will be comprised of these models that exist throughout the life of the system. It's something new. Of course, there are many people who haven't even thought about this. There are some organizations that are actually very advanced in this. There's a lot to learn about how a model curation function could support that. And then the other type of model that I see in there are reusable or repurposable models. They might be reference architectures, for example. And so the question is, how could we make these things available in a collection so that a whole enterprise had access to these? A few things that having such a large collection would require are the governance, the different controls and the policies, for example, policies around strategic loan of a model. You'd need some kind of protocols for use and things like permissions of who was allowed to access certain models, cybersecurity, of course, and then the infrastructure. Enabling technology is something where I could see a lot of research in the future going. If you have a collection, you want to discover a model, you want to decide if a model is useful, we have a whole lot of newer technologies that are out there that people are experimenting with that could help us in this regard. There's not a lot out there in the literature specifically concerning model repositories for engineering, but a few recent papers are starting to talk about this. And this first paper in 2015 said that researchers and practitioners seem to prefer management of their modeling artifacts locally. And I think that's a behavior that we still see. People don't like to give up the models that they've worked on so hard and give them to someone who might change them, might use them in a way that they think aren't appropriate. So we have to get beyond that kind of behavior where we feel like we have to own everything locally. Second, in the more recent paper in 2020, this cited that the adoption of repositories, although they may be existing out in companies and government agencies, is somewhat sporadic. But there does seem to be a lot of growing convergence that large model repositories could be very useful. And in order for them to be useful, they would have to have some kind of competence measures associated with the models. If you're going to use a model that someone else developed, the question is, how would you judge whether or not you trust that model? We've been looking at trust and model-centric engineering for a little while now in various studies. We're looking at model credibility, model confidence, model trust, all these related topics. And in current times, we've seen this behavior and we've seen this kind of story come out many times. When a modeler is asked to produce a model of a certain type and they bring it to the senior decision maker, there's usually some kind of comment that says, well, okay, I see what your model says, but go ask Fred because Fred knows about these things. We were told that story by one of the people in a large interview-based study we did, but I've seen that same kind of behavior expressed by many different organizations. It's this idea that, well, we have to make a decision and the model is telling us a lot of things about the what the decision should be, but nonetheless we still tend to place our trust on the people, that trusted agent, say, that sits between model and senior decision maker. So then the question is, if that's the case, how do we give a model consumer, like the senior decision maker in this case, the information that would basically replace going and calling up Fred? This is a very important question in my view, and we have a lot of work in the field that is looking at things like model verification, model validation, configuration management. Those things are all still essentially important, but layered on top of those are issues that relate to human trust in models. So we would have to have the properties in our collection have been verified, validated, consistent. We'd want them to be evaluated with what is their worth. We want them to be relevant to current times, current contexts. And then these last three, trusted, and it turns out from our studies and from other people's studies that known provenance is important. Who originated that model? That helps us trust or distrust a model. And then also we would want those models to be discoverable in the collection. And if we have very large collections, that's going to be easier said than done. We've looked at some of the criteria by which a model curator would decide whether something should come into a collection. And these criteria relate to both the readiness and the acceptability of that model. In some work which was done under the US DoD Systems Engineering Research Center, the CERC, we looked into the criteria for this, and we sort of settled on 6 major things thus far. Relevance to the enterprise, completeness of the metadata, the data, and all the documentation that would go with the model, the completeness of model pedigree, whether it could be redistributed, reused, or repurposed. And that would involve, IP, human subjects kind of issues, any other restrictions. The uniqueness of that model in terms of whether it's easily replicable, then it might not be worth the investment of putting it into a collection. And then, of course, there has to be an economic business case. Now, let me come back to completeness of model pedigree. So model pedigree is not necessarily a well-known construct in the systems field. It comes out of the OR community. It's been around for 50 plus 60 years now, but I think we in the systems community have not made use of model pedigree as much. So model pedigree, if you think of what we ordinarily would have for technical metadata, The model pedigree tells you things that make a model consumer trust a model. So these would relate to things like the originator of the model, what the context for use of the model was, what assumptions went into the model. And if it was a reused model, you would want to know things about, well, who changed this model and what did they do to it? So these are the six that we have been working with in terms of the idea for the criteria. And to initially test some of these out on the circ research, we used the Skyzer surrogate pilot program information and created a sort of illustrated or hypothetical example of a situation where if we had a large collection that was available for researchers throughout the whole community, how would we make a decision on whether we could bring one of those models into a collection? So this is put out there as kind of an initial set. I think we're going to need a lot more work as a community to settle on which ones are most important. And I'm sure we're missing a few in here, but that gives you an idea of the kinds of considerations that would be made. Because model trust, model credibility is so important, this is one area that we've been doing and continue to do a lot of research on. We've had interview-based studies on model-centric decision-making. We've studied legacy literature and research findings on credibility, and we're currently studying model confidence. And in fact, those of you who are SDM alums will have an email that you've received from my colleague, Dr. Eric Reventish, requesting whether you would participate in our latest study. We have to get the voice of the community into our work, and we do that in order to learn more and more about credibility. But we also find this great collection of studies that have been done in other fields that we can draw on. Now, I want to make three important points concerning model credibility. So one thing that happens sometimes is that people attribute model credibility to being an attribute of the model, and it's not. So model credibility is an attribute of the model consumer. So you could make the best model in the world, but if there's something that makes the model consumer not trust it, then it's not going to get used. So what are the things that are coming into play here? Things that we have found and that others have found through their studies are that the expertise of the model consumer, of course, has some degree of impact on their perceived credibility. And that, obviously people with more experience and so forth would have a different type of trust than a novice. Model credibility is influenced by the individual model consumer's trust in who originated the model. We've seen that in many other studies, as well as indicated in the expert opinions that we've gathered in our expert research. And individual propensity for trust is another one that affects things. Any individual may trust things more than another. A second thing that we have to accept in order to have curated model collections is that perceived model credibility is going to shift as that model consumer has their own experience context evolve. And we have seen, context can be the larger context to use the model, and context could be the individual model consumers' context within their own enterprise, like the enterprise infrastructure, how models are governed, etc. So if you take enabling infrastructure, the credibility of models in a collection we have seen through what we've studied is, and there are some very important studies out there that reinforce this, that the trust in the infrastructure is an important part of whether models themselves are trusted. Expertise of the governance authority. So if we have a model curation authority in our enterprise, model credibility is going to be judged by whether the model consumer thinks the people who are deciding, for example, that a model belongs in the collection are making sound decisions. And then we've also seen this behavior where people feel a model is more credible if they feel it has the ability to produce information that's of current value to them in their current context of use. A third area, perception of credibility changes as a model consumer interacts with those models and interacts with a repository. When a model is first originated, there's often active communication between that model consumer and the modeler. In our studies, we've seen people express the fact that this is a very important factor in whether they trust things. If we're going to look at the idea of having models in a repository, we have to be able to somehow record that communication so that the model consumer has like access to this passive communication. This again is what I mentioned in terms of model pedigree. In model pedigree, we could store, for example, the story of how that model was originated. We could store the story of someone who repurposed, reused that model and the decisions that were made with it. We have to preserve that communication. We also find that the expertise of the model originator, as well as the people who then subsequently enhance and maintain it, are all important in that perception of credibility. People have more trust in a model if they feel they have transparency. And we found a very interesting thing in our study is that people don't necessarily want total transparency. Some model consumers will, but some want to at least know they can have transparency. But it's not just transparency into the model and its attributes, but transparency into any changes that are made. And then if we have models that are reused over time, people also want transparency into whatever validation activities and model changes that were made over the life cycle of that model. And third, the perception of the credibility of a model itself is going to be influenced by how easily someone thinks they can discover and retrieve models from a repository. So I would argue that although we are doing some great things around making models of the quality that they have a lot of integrity, we should be able to trust them. There are also these subtle soft factors that we have to think about that are going to be true influences on the decision to use a model. So many different facets. Model credibility is around the practices, it's around the required leadership that you need. It's related to the quality of the infrastructure itself. And I think as we go forward, we'll increasingly find ways that we can curate model for the specific consumer needs. And the ability to do that will turn out to be very important in whether this idea of a shared model repository would be useful and used by an enterprise. And I think some of the really interesting research is trying to figure out how to use some newer technologies so that we can enhance model discovery. So I'd like to share with you what I think are some of the challenges that we're facing around this and some of the current and future directions for research. I've mentioned a few times about a large enterprise and having a model collection. So the question is, can we scale that same kind of thing for small and medium-sized enterprises? Since a curated model collection would require a fair amount of investment in a really small enterprise like a startup, it probably wouldn't be valuable to initially have a curated model collection. But in the medium-sized enterprise, I think it will. And the question is, how do you really scale that? So some of the things that we've thought about in this idea of using curated models in small and medium-sized enterprises are the following. One is if you're a small enterprise and you're used to working more informally and quickly and getting things done because you can have a lot of active conversation with people, there are some potential difficulties in imposing, controls and processes. And the question is, if it's a smaller collection, would you get the same return on investment that you would in a large collection? The governance of a collection is, as I've said, probably a committee of people. And so with high turnover enterprises, fast-paced enterprises, enterprises where there's say, a continuous 2-year turnover in leadership, would you be able to deal with that if there was so much turnover in a governance board? So the question is, one of the questions is, if you had a curation governance committee or board, should some people be standing members while others would change out? And in a small or medium-paced medium enterprise, you might find that many of these are also fast-paced enterprises. Large corporations, legacy enterprises, sometimes the pace at which models are used might be slower. But in a situation where there's a lot of turnover, a lot of new products, the question is, how could we deal with this then rapid rate by which models are updated? And how would you really quickly be able to monitor and take models out of your collection when you needed to? And then model sharing is something that we need to be concerned with no matter what the size of the enterprise is. So. We have had some organizations that we've worked with that have tried to put some level of curation in place. And the question comes up, who should be making the decisions for the acquisition, for putting a model into the collection? And this is particularly challenging, I think, in large enterprises where you have lots of business units. And how do you make sure you have the right people making those decisions? Again, what seems to be probably the best approach might be to have certain members of that curation board who would be standing members. And then when you were making a decision on a particular model, bringing in some specific people who would be probably, you might need some domain experts and then maybe experts related to the particular type of model that is. And certainly, I think many of you can relate that people don't like to give up their models. And so this idea of if you have repositories that exist, say at the local level, at a project or program level, or even a business unit level, how would you get those groups to turn things over and let an enterprise level board make decisions on those models? And it may be that it will never work to put all models in one big collection. And I'm not personally working on it, but there's some work out there that is looking at federated approaches. And this may be one way that we can do it, to have kind of a, think of it as like a system of systems of models in repositories. So these are many different things that we have been thinking about in terms of the composition for the governance board. Um, sorry, I think I got one. Okay, so curated model collections, challenges and opportunities, significant IP challenges in model sharing. We see that already. I think we'll continue to see that increase in magnitude as models become more valuable to us. They're more valuable to us because they're, say, part of they're a digital twin. They're more valuable to us because they're not a one-time use, but a repurposable model. We've got a significant challenge in convincing people that if they're going to have a curated model collection at the enterprise level, that we would want to create and maintain these curated model collections. So how do we get the investment in this? It's hard enough to do, say, at a program level. Where would an enterprise get the resources to be able to make this vision come true? And then further, if we did get to a place where we had very large collections of models, how would we deal with the fact that it's going to be harder and harder to discover models? And that's going to be an important factor in whether models get used or not. One of the examples that I saw out there in recent years is a company that had, kind of a, I guess I would call it a specialized enterprise collection of models. They were one type of model, and in that collection, they had people who were responsible for the repository. They were maintaining the models, but of a collection that had 125 models in it, they said only 10% of them were actually used. So that begs the question, are people finding it too difficult to discover these models and to make the decision on reuse? Or is it that they don't have a good deaccession process so that they have models that are outdated in the collection? We need more studies, more research to understand how we can make discovery of models in a collection become easier. There are, I think, opportunities for collaboratively developed model collections. I've been talking about the idea of a collection belonging to, say, a company or government agency, but as a community, professional societies are certainly one where we might see some community level effort to develop a committee. And we see this in the biomedical area, the biological systems area, and there are a number of different repositories out there today. Biomodels is one that's been around for a long time. These model repositories are well accepted in the community and people make use of them. However, these are usually, say, mathematical models. And so they're all of one type. And what about the idea of a model collection where we want to have a heterogeneous collection of models? This is going to be like much more complex challenge. So what would that kind of collection involve? Well, it would be a collection that gets more extensive governance, because you would need more people involved in the governance. if you had more types of models. You'd also be having to curate that collection for multiple stakeholders' needs so that different types of stakeholders, for example, might use a finite element model versus a SysML model. So if we had one collection at an enterprise level that had all of these models, we'd have to understand the preferences that individual stakeholders have for how they would interact with that repository as well. And then with a multi-stakeholder model consumer base, there are going to be a lot of different factors by which the stakeholders will judge the credibility of the model. An interesting study that was done, actually, it was a series of studies that was done at Stanford by BJ Fogg and colleagues, were around website credibility. And if you think back to that period, I mean, websites were more static and they were very dense with information. And some of their findings were that website credibility was found to increase when users could tell that there was a real world organization and real people behind it. So this would, for example, suggest that for a curated model repository, we'd want some kind of marker on there, some kind of indication that this is a collection that is governed by an authentic body. And they also found in their studies that people actually thought the website was less credible if they saw a typo or they had problems with downloading information. So in a study like this, think of this as somewhat comparable to, say, a model repository with lots of models and lots of information. These things that relate to the infrastructure itself, if they're not done well, they're really going to have an influence on the actual trustworthiness of the models. Another study I thought was really interesting that I ran across recently was where there was a group looking at trust in digital repositories and from a population of two different types of people. And think of an envisioned future where we had different types of engineers, different types of decision makers trying to use the same repository. So in this study, they had archaeologists and quantitative social sciences, and they use different types of data. They're at different levels of maturity around data reuse. The repositories themselves are at different stages of maturity. And what they found is that trust in the repositories is a separate and distinct factor from trust in the data, similar to what the group at Stanford found around website credibility. And they found that trust influences how data reusers actually approach these repositories, and trust colors their interaction with the repositories. And if you look deeper at this, their study reveals how different, different cultures, archaeologists versus quantitative social sciences, think about trust, and some of the differences were that, say, archaeologists mentioned guarantees of preservation and sustainability more frequently as a factor versus social science, who wanted to know more about the institutional reputation behind the digital repository. And then another difference where one population, archaeologists, were citing metadata issues while social scientists were more concerned about data selection and cleaning processes. And they also saw a difference in with novices. They thought that their trust was influenced by their colleagues' trust. And so I just put this up here as food for thought, that if we have different types of engineers, different types of decision makers accessing models, that we can't just think of them as one size fits all. There are a lot of variations depending on people's experience level, depending on their education background, depending on the whole legacy of the processes they use. Curated model collection challenges are also somewhat different for open curated repository. So this may be where engineering might go in the future. I've had some interesting conversations over the last couple years with some colleagues at the University of Minnesota, Professor Elad Tadmor and Professor Ryan Elliott. They've developed, since I think it started in 2009, this open repository of interatomic models. It's worth a look. They've established quite a interesting repository and all of the practices and things that go with it. Some of the things that they found to be very important through their work with an open curated repository were the standards, controls, and norms for use had to be well defined. You had to have some kind of risk mitigation around intellectual property concerns that people have. Permissions, that turns out to be, of course, a very critical thing, setting, requesting, and then, of course, funding and resourcing for the initial effort. But I think keeping it going is something that is, I think, probably a continued challenge. But they've been managed to since 2009 to have established this, and it's still being very actively used. New technologies, lots of things out there in data science, visual analytics. Imagine you have a repository, you want to discover some models. You could also use things like machine learning, perhaps in discovery. You could use machine learning in doing the actual curation themselves. Some of the curated repositories out there, like from the bio community, they are often still like half of them are curated by humans and half of them are using automated technology. So lots could be done in that regard. And I also think it's very interesting to think about how we could implement some kind of augmented intelligence capability if we were trying to reuse models, and especially if we were trying to repurpose a model for some very different context. So today, I mean, that's a hugely complex problem for a human to think through, thinking about all the assumptions that went into model and how relevant they were for what the problem being considered was. So I think having some way to augment the human's decisions around model use and will be important, and lots of work could be done in that regard. So these are some of all just the future research directions that we've been thinking about. We have tackled some of these, but not others. We know that if we're going to achieve this idea of enterprise model collections, that the value of these collections needs to outweigh the investment that it takes to create and maintain them. But I think they can be very powerful for us in the future, especially as we get into this world where every system has a digital twin. Among all of these, I think the farthest reaching and the one that I think has the ultimate potential is the idea of a digital demonstrator. And this is what I envision art of the possible would be. Let's say I'm working on a competitive bid or market opportunity, and I want to demonstrate for my potential customer sponsor what I can do, what capabilities I have. Imagine that you could reach into a model collection and you could pull out some models and put them together in such a way that you could actually demonstrate what your solution looked like. So we're quite a ways from that one, I think, but that's where this whole field could go, in my view. So thanks. I hope I've shared a few ideas with you for where this could go. And we are, as a research group at MIT, very interested in hearing from people if you are doing this kind of work or if you are having suggestions for future research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. This was fascinating. I admit my experience is more on the archive side than on the model side, but I definitely learned a lot from this. We do already have a few questions in the chat, so I will just run through those. And again, if you have further questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat window. Um, First, a couple of housekeeping questions. People were wondering if you would be sharing or able to share the slide deck and if there was a bibliography for this talk.
Absolutely. And yes, we do have some references for you, and we'll figure out a way to put that out there.
For sure. People can contact us at sdmcommunications@mit.edu, which I will also drop in the chat with requests for slides or the bibliography. And then for questions, Sophia Salas asks, how can one objectively assess the value of a model? Has a set of metrics for the necessary properties of model collection that you mentioned been proposed?
Well, I think that's the dilemma. I don't think we can totally objectively judge it. We can do what's a combination of objective and subjective, in my view, that judging is always going to be done by the individual who's doing the judging. But there are things that we can do to establish different confidence measures so that that person could do the best, could have the best informed way to make that subjective judgment. For the objective way, of course, the objective side of it, that's all the stuff that's being done, not by me, but by others on judging integrity of models, of showing verification, validation, etc. So I really think it's a dual challenge for us, objective plus subjective.
That makes sense. And I will note that Len Malsinski responded in the chat to Sophia saying that we, the system dynamics modeling community, have found how easy it is to discover poor quality. We have started to develop objective and subjective quality measures. And I think that does get to the heart of you can have some objective measures, but they will also need to be adapted for different model sets and different situations. Another question, Don W asks, technical user guides, if accurate, clear, comprehensive, and regularly updated, are customer-centric, curated, credible documents. What is their specific role, if any, in a curated model system?
So the documents, what are the documents for?
Technical user guides.
Technical user guides, like for a model or system. I mean, I think there's probably I don't know enough about the situation to answer this totally, but I think that things like that exist, I mean, they should be somehow tied into and connected to things in this repository. I don't know, again, if you would store everything in one big repository, but there can be ways to link to other external documents.
Yeah, perhaps Don will clarify further in the chat if he's still with us. While we wait to see if any other questions come in as well, I just wanted to note that, as I mentioned, I come from a background where I have friends and colleagues who are archivists, librarians, curators, and I was curious as to whether in your work you've worked with archivists and people in that kind of field talking about best practices for curation. I know you referenced the museum as kind of our analogy or metaphor at the start, but it does seem like there would be a lot to learn as far as curation, how to handle accession, desection, and all of that.
Absolutely. And yes, I have done that. Not in the last 2 years, I would say, because we work on this in bits and pieces. But I had some really interesting conversations with people who were in institutional curation, like museum kind of thing. I've had conversations with people doing digital curation and other, researchers around curated collections. So I think that's a really important part of what we need to do. I think there's a tremendous amount out there to learn. One thing, for example, that I discovered some years back was that a thesis was done, a graduate thesis was done related to digital curation. So I've been searching for all these treasures out there, and I would love it if we had research funding to do a more methodical study on going out and talking to all these different experts in the field.
For sure. And it definitely makes sense just so far as not reinventing the wheel
Yeah,
for this curation.
absolutely.
It looks like we don't have further questions in the talk right now or in the chat window right now. So I think we can let you go a little early, let everyone have 3 extra minutes. Um,
Great.
so once again, thank you to everyone who attended this webinar. Again, the recording will be available online after this session. And we hope you'll join us in March for the next Systems Thinking webinar. And thank you once again to Dr. Rhodes for speaking today. And on behalf of the System Design and Management Program, thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.